What happens when Shaquille O'Neal walks into a pharmacy and sees an elderly woman being denied her medicine? Would he just stand by or teach everyone a lesson they'd never forget? Hey, real quick, before we get into this wild story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Margaret's frail hands tremble as she pushes open the heavy glass door of the pharmacy. The sharp scent of antiseptic fills the air, mixing with the low hum of refrigerators stocked with medication. She tightens her grip on her small, faded purse, pressing it close to her chest as if it holds more than just a few crumpled bills. It holds the last of her hope. The pharmacy is nearly empty. A young woman in a business suit scrolls through her phone while waiting for her order. A mother holds her toddler close as she picks up cough syrup. The pharmacist, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, barely glances at Margaret as she approaches the counter. She musters up a small, hopeful smile. "I'm here for my prescription refill," she says, her voice soft yet steady. The pharmacist barely acknowledges her, typing on his computer before checking the bag behind the counter. "That'll be $320, he says flatly, sliding the bag forward. Margaret's breath catches in her throat. She swallows hard, forcing herself to stay calm as she reaches into her purse. Her fingers brush against a handful of worn dollar bills and a few coins, far less than what she needs. She already knew it wouldn't be enough, but seeing the number in front of her still feels like a punch to the gut. "Maybe I can just buy half the medicine?" she asks, her voice barely above a whisper. She shifts on her feet, glancing behind her as the line grows, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The pharmacist barely looks up. "We don't sell half, full price, or nothing." Margaret's fingers tighten around the edge of the counter. I just need enough to get through the week." The pharmacist exhales sharply, clearly irritated. "I said no, it's full price." The woman in the business suit shifts uncomfortably. The mother in line furrows her brow. For a second, Margaret wonders if someone will step forward, if someone will help, but no one does. They just glance away, pretending they don't see. Margaret's shoulders sink. Slowly, she gathers her purse and nods. "I understand." She turns toward the door, her head hanging low. Each step feels heavier than the last. As she pushes open the door, the cold evening air rushes in, making her shiver. She blinks back the sting of tears, determined not to cry. Inside the pharmacy, the pharmacist has already moved on to the next customer, his voice indifferent. Margaret takes a deep breath, staring down at the sidewalk. She doesn't know what to do next, but just as she steps forward, a shadow looms over her. A deep, familiar voice speaks from behind. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you okay?" She turns, startled, and standing there, towering over everyone, is none other than Shaquille O'Neal. Margaret's thin frame moves slowly, her small steps hesitant as she makes her way toward the exit. The weight of the moment presses on her shoulders. She had come in with a shred of hope, only to leave empty-handed. But just as she reaches the door, a massive figure enters the pharmacy, nearly filling the entire doorway. The air in the room shifts. People glance up. Some freeze mid-step. Shaquille O'Neal, dressed in a black hoodie and gray sweats, casually steps inside, ducking slightly to clear the frame. He's just here to pick up some vitamins. But within seconds, his sharp eyes scan the room, immediately sensing something is off. He notices Margaret right away. The way she clutches her tiny purse like a lifeline, the defeated slump of her shoulders, the way she hesitates before stepping outside, as if leaving means giving up. And then he notices the pharmacist, already moving on to the next customer, his tone flat and indifferent. Shaq has seen a lot in his life, but there's something about an elderly woman struggling just to afford her medicine that doesn't sit right with him. He moves toward the counter but keeps one eye on Margaret, watching as she shuffles forward, her frail hands gripping the door handle. The deep rumble of his voice breaks the silence. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you okay?" Margaret freezes. Slowly, she turns around, looking up, way up, at the towering man before her. Her eyes widen slightly. Even in her sadness, even in her exhaustion, she recognizes him. But her instinct is to brush it off. She doesn't want to trouble anyone, let alone a man who has more important things to do. She forces a smile, though it barely reaches her eyes. "Oh, I just forgot my wallet," she says softly, tucking the purse closer to her chest. Shaq narrows his eyes. He knows that tone too well, the quiet dignity of someone trying to hide their struggle. "Forgot it, huh?" he says, tilting his head slightly, studying her expression. Margaret nods quickly, eager to escape. "Yes, I'll just come back another day." Shaq doesn't believe her. His gaze flicks toward the pharmacist, who avoids eye contact. The whole exchange had played out in front of him, yet he didn't care. He had treated Margaret like she was invisible. Shaq clenches his jaw. Margaret offers another polite nod and turns back toward the door. This time she doesn't hesitate. Shaq watches as she disappears outside, the glass door swinging shut behind her. He doesn't move. Instead, he slowly turns back toward the counter, placing both massive hands on the surface. The pharmacist barely looks up, uninterested. Shaq leans in slightly. His deep voice drops just enough to make the man's shoulders stiffen. How much was her medicine? The glass door swings shut behind Margaret, leaving behind an eerie silence. Shaq stands motionless for a moment, his gaze locked on the counter where the pharmacist stands, already moving on to the next customer. Shaq has seen a lot of things in his life. People struggling, people in need. But something about watching an elderly woman walk away without the medicine she needed, all because of money, hits differently. His massive frame shifts, and he steps forward, the weight of his presence instantly felt by everyone around him. How much was her medicine? His deep voice rumbles through the pharmacy, making heads turn. The pharmacist, a middle-aged man with graying hair and an uninterested expression, barely looks up. He sighs, adjusting his name tag as if Shaq is nothing more than another impatient customer. Not your business, he mutters, tapping at the computer. The words hang in the air for a beat too long. Shaq's eyes narrow. He leans forward slightly, placing both of his massive hands on the counter. I just made it my business. For the first time, the pharmacist actually looks up, only to be met with the unmistakable presence of a 7'1" NBA legend towering over him. His throat bobs as he swallows. The room feels smaller now. Reluctantly, he taps at the keyboard, then glances at the screen. $320, he says flatly. Shaq's eyebrows lift. For a month's supply? The pharmacist lets out a small chuckle. Number that was 1 week's worth. Shaq's jaw tightens. Shaq takes a slow breath, glancing around. The other customers have gone quiet, listening in. An older woman shifts uncomfortably in line. A father holding a toddler looks away, pretending not to notice. They've seen this happen before. Shaq looks back at the pharmacist, his expression unreadable. So, she's supposed to come up with $1,280 every month just to stay alive? The pharmacist shrugs. It's not my problem. Company sets the prices. Shaq doesn't move. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't have to. How much if I buy it for her? The pharmacist barely hesitates before responding. Same price. No discounts. A flicker of something crosses Shaq's face. Annoyance? Disbelief? Disgust? So, you can give discounts, Shaq says, voice measured. You just won't. The pharmacist scoffs. Not for people like her? The words hit like a slap. Shaq exhales slowly, his massive shoulders rising and falling. There are moments in life when you see something wrong, and you have a choice. Walk away or do something about it. Shaq isn't the type to walk away. He straightens, his presence growing even larger. Yeah, see, that's going to be a problem. The tension in the pharmacy is thick, almost suffocating. The customers who were once minding their business now watch with a mix of curiosity and unease. Shaq, his towering presence impossible to ignore, keeps his eyes locked on the pharmacist. His patience is wearing thin, but he doesn't explode. He never does. Instead, he leans in slightly, his deep voice cutting through the silence. So let me get this straight. You give discounts, but not for people like her? The pharmacist shifts uncomfortably, but doesn't back down. That's how business works, he says with a smirk. Some people are just better customers. Shaq crosses his arms, his sharp gaze shifting toward the next customer in line. A man in a tailored suit, easily worth thousands of dollars. The man steps forward, placing his prescription on the counter. The pharmacist's entire demeanor changes. His smirk transforms into a welcoming smile, his voice softer, more polite. Ah, Mr. Reynolds, you're in luck today. We have a special discount for our premium customers, 20% off. Shaq watches the interaction, his mind absorbing every detail. Just moments ago, he told Margaret there were no discounts. Now suddenly there is. Huh, Shaq mutters, shaking his head. Mr. Reynolds notices Shaq watching him and shifts nervously. I can come back later if this is a bad time. Shaq holds up a hand. Nah, man, you're good. Go ahead and get your discount. He looks back at the pharmacist. But I got a question. The pharmacist sighs dramatically. What now? Shaq's tone remains calm, but there's an edge beneath it. How much if I buy Margaret's medicine for her? The smirk returns. Same price, no discounts. Shaq lets out a small laugh, but there's no humor in it. So she's not a premium customer, huh? The pharmacist shrugs. Look, man, I don't make the rules. You just enforce them when it benefits you. Shaq's voice is steady, but there's a storm behind his words. The pharmacist's smile falters. You want the medicine or not? Shaq looks at the price on the screen again. $320 for 1 week. That's not just high. That's predatory. Shaq shakes his head. You know what's funny? I could buy this whole store. Hell, I could buy the company that owns this store. He leans in, his voice dropping just slightly. And I might just do that. The pharmacist swallows, realizing he might have made a mistake. But Shaq isn't finished. He turns to the other customers. Y'all ever wonder why medicine is so expensive? Or why some folks get treated better than others? The room is dead silent. Shaq looks back at the pharmacist, his expression unreadable. Yeah, this isn't over. Shaq steps out of the pharmacy, his mind still spinning with frustration. The cool evening air does little to calm the fire burning inside him. Margaret was just here, humiliated, turned away like she was invisible. And now she was gone. His eyes scan the street, but the elderly woman is nowhere to be seen. She couldn't have gone far, right? People walk by, lost in their own lives, oblivious to what just happened inside. Shaq exhales, running a hand over his beard. He isn't about to let this go. Across the street, a teenage boy on a bicycle watches him curiously. He's about 14, wearing a faded hoodie and sneakers that have seen better days. He isn't staring at Shaq the way most people do, with excitement or awe. No, this kid looks observant. Shaq strides over. Yo, kid, you see an old lady walk by? Small gray hair, wearing a brown coat? The boy blinks, then nods. Yeah, she was walking real slow, like she was tired. Shaq's chest tightens. Of course she's tired. She's been carrying the weight of the world on her frail shoulders. You know where she lives? Shaq asks, his voice calm but urgent. The kid hesitates, glancing at Shaq's massive frame. Why you asking? Shaq kneels down slightly, leveling his gaze with the boys. I want to help her. The kid studies him for a moment before nodding. Yeah, she's 2 blocks down. Little blue house with a busted mailbox. Shaq smiles. Thanks, man. What's your name? Jason. Shaq reaches into his pocket, pulls out a crisp $20 bill, and hands it to him. Appreciate it, Jason. The boy's eyes widen. Whoa, thanks. Shaq pats his shoulder before turning toward the direction of Margaret's house. Shaq walks past dimly lit houses, each one holding its own story. The farther he goes, the more run down the neighborhood becomes. Some homes have broken porches, others have windows covered with plastic instead of glass. It hits him. Margaret isn't just struggling with medication, she's struggling with everything. Finally, he spots it, the small blue house Jason described. The paint is chipping, and the mailbox leans to one side, its flag missing. The front yard is mostly dirt with patches of overgrown weeds. Shaq steps up to the door and knocks gently. No answer. He knocks again. Ms. Margaret, it's me, Shaq. For a moment, nothing. Then a soft, shuffling sound from inside. The door creaks open just an inch. Margaret's tired eyes peer up at him through the crack. Oh, it's you, she says hesitantly. Shaq smiles warmly. Yes, ma'am. Sorry to bother you, but I wasn't done talking to you back at the pharmacy. Margaret hesitates, glancing around as if worried someone might see. You shouldn't have followed me, son. I don't want any trouble. Shaq shakes his head. No trouble, I promise. I just want to talk. Margaret sighs, then slowly opens the door. I suppose you might as well come in. Shaq steps inside and immediately notices the state of her home. The place is clean but worn. The furniture looks decades old, patched together with duct tape. The kitchen table is wobbly, and the fridge hums loudly, struggling to keep running. And then, Shaq spots something that makes his stomach drop. A nearly empty fridge. A single carton of milk, some bread, and a jar of peanut butter. This wasn't just about medicine. Margaret was barely surviving. Shaq clenches his jaw. Miss Margaret, we need to talk. Margaret's thin fingers grip the doorknob as she peers up at Shaq, confusion flickering across her wrinkled face. She had expected to spend the evening alone, wrapping herself in layers to keep the creeping cold at bay. But here stood the towering man from the pharmacy, his concerned eyes scanning her frail frame. Miss Margaret, I just wanted to check on you, Shaq says gently. For a moment she seems unsure, gripping the door as if contemplating closing it again. Then with a slow sigh, she steps aside. Well, I suppose a lead. Tell company wouldn't hurt. Shaq ducks slightly to fit through the doorway, stepping inside. As soon as he does, his heart clenches. The living room is small, barely big enough for a couch and a coffee table covered in neatly stacked envelopes. Bills. A tiny heater rattles in the corner, barely producing any warmth. The floral wallpaper is peeling in spots, and the smell of old wood lingers in the air. Shaq's eyes drift toward the kitchen. A single bare light bulb flickers above the sink, casting shadows over an empty dish rack. Then his gaze moves to the fridge. It's an old model, humming weakly, the handle slightly rusted. Margaret follows his eyes and offers a nervous chuckle. It still works, mostly. Something about the way she says it makes Shaq's stomach tighten. He steps closer, placing his massive hand on the fridge door, and slowly pulls it open. Inside, there's barely anything. A half-empty carton of milk, a small tub of butter, a loaf of bread in a thin plastic bag, a jar of peanut butter nearly scraped clean. Shaq exhales sharply, pressing his lips together. This isn't just about medicine. She's struggling with everything. Margaret shifts uncomfortably, watching him. I get by, she says softly. Shaq turns to her. When was the last time you had a full meal? Margaret waves a hand dismissively. Oh, don't you worry about me. I eat just fine. But the way she avoids eye contact tells him otherwise. Just then, a small noise catches Shaq's attention, a faint rustling from the other room. He looks toward the hallway. Ms. Margaret, are you alone? Her face changes. It's subtle, but he catches it. Her lips press into a thin line, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. Shaq's voice softens. Who else is here? Margaret hesitates, then sighs. Come with me. She slowly leads him toward a tiny bedroom at the end of the hall. The door is already slightly open. Shaq steps inside, and what he sees makes his breath catch in his throat. Curled up on a worn-out couch, covered with a thin blanket, is a small boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old. His chest rises and falls in steady breaths, his tiny fingers gripping the edge of the blanket for warmth. Shaq looks at Margaret, stunned. Who is he? Margaret swallows hard. That's Jason, my grandson. Shaq's chest tightens. This just became bigger than he ever imagined. Shaq stood in the dimly lit bedroom, his towering frame nearly filling the doorway. His eyes remained locked on the sleeping boy, Jason, curled up on the threadbare couch. The blanket wrapped around him was too thin for the cold night, and his tiny hands clutched it tightly as if holding onto warmth that barely existed. That's your grandson? Shaq asked softly, turning to Margaret. She nodded, pressing her frail hands together. He's all I have left. Shaq had come here thinking Margaret needed help with her medicine. But this was something else entirely. His gaze drifted back to the small room. The walls were faded, the wallpaper peeling at the edges. A single shelf held a few dusty picture frames, memories of better days. There was no TV, no toys scattered around, just an old lamp barely bright enough to push back the darkness. Margaret sighed. I didn't want anyone to know, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. People assume I'm just an old woman living alone, and maybe that's easier than explaining everything. Shaq walked back into the kitchen, his mind racing. The fridge door was still slightly open from earlier, revealing its nearly empty shelves. Milk almost gone, bread nearly stale, a half-eaten can of soup. He shook his head. Margaret, how long have y'all been living like this? She hesitated before answering. Since Jason's parents passed. Shaq's eyes flicked back toward the boy. How? Margaret lowered herself into a chair, the weight of years pressing down on her shoulders. My daughter, Jason's mother, was in a car accident 3 years ago. His father, he wasn't in the picture to begin with. When it happened, Jason had nowhere else to go but here. She forced a small, sad smile. We get by. I stretch what I can. I make sure he eats first. Shaq's jaw tightened. And what about you? Margaret chuckled weakly. I'm old. I don't need much. Shaq exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. This wasn't right. This wasn't how she should be living. Margaret had been skipping meals to keep Jason fed. She had been suffering in silence, choosing between groceries and medicine, all while making sure the little boy never felt the full weight of their struggle, and no one had stepped in to help, until now. Shaq clenched his fists, his mind already forming a plan. Just then, Jason stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked sleepily, then sat up with a start when he saw Shaq's massive frame. Whoa, you're huge, Margaret chuckled. Jason, this is Shaquille O'Neal. He's just visiting. Jason rubbed his eyes. Like, the Shaq? His eyes lit up. The basketball guy? Shaq grinned. The one and only little man. Jason stared at him for a moment, then looked around the room, his excitement fading. Wait, why are you here? Shaq knelt beside him, his voice gentle. Just checking on you and your grandma, buddy. Jason frowned, glancing at Margaret, who offered him a reassuring smile. We're okay, he said, though the hesitation in his voice told Shaq otherwise. Shaq stood up, his decision made. He turned back to Margaret. All right, Ms. Margaret, I'll be right back. Margaret's brows furrowed. Where are you going? Shaq flashed a determined smile. To fix this. And with that, he grabbed his phone and headed out the door. Shaq stepped out onto the quiet street, the cold night air brushing against his face. He exhaled sharply, glancing back at Margaret's small, worn-down house. The dim glow from inside cast long shadows on the porch, and through the window, he could see Margaret gently tucking a blanket around Jason. This wasn't just about medicine anymore. He pulled out his phone, his fingers tightening around it. Yeah, I need a favor, he said the moment the call connected. Now. The person on the other end hesitated before responding. Shaq, it's late. What's going on? Shaq's voice was firm. I'll explain when you get here. Just bring the paperwork and make it quick. The man sighed but didn't argue. All right, I'm on my way. Shaq hung up and glanced around. The street was silent, the flickering streetlights giving the neighborhood an eerie stillness. He had spent his entire life helping people in need, but this situation hit differently. Margaret wasn't just struggling, she was barely surviving, and no one had stepped in. That was about to change. Minutes passed. Shaq paced near the curb, his mind racing with everything he had just seen. The empty fridge, the worn-out furniture, Jason's too small blanket. Margaret skipping meals just to keep the boy fed. A lump formed in his throat, but he swallowed it down, not on his watch. A low hum of an engine broke the silence. Headlights cut through the darkness as a sleek black SUV rolled up to the curb. The door swung open, and two sharply dressed men stepped out. One was DeAndre Wells, Shaq's trusted financial advisor, a sharp-minded man in his early 40s with an always serious expression. The other was Mark Rosen, a real estate lawyer who handled some of Shaq's biggest deals. They weren't here for basketball. You weren't kidding when you said urgent, DeAndre said, adjusting his suit jacket. What's going on? Shaq nodded toward the house. That's what we're here to fix. Shaq quickly explained Margaret's situation, how she couldn't afford her medicine, how she was living off scraps, how she had taken in Jason despite barely having enough for herself. Mark rubbed his chin, nodding. Okay, so what are you thinking? Shaq didn't hesitate. First, we're paying off this house. Full ownership, no debt. DeAndre raised an eyebrow. Done? What else? Set up a trust. Jason's still a kid, but I want a fund in place for him. Education, food, medical, whatever they need. Mark scribbled notes onto a legal pad. Got it. Shaq crossed his arms. And one more thing. Make sure she never has to worry about medicine again. Whatever insurance, coverage, or deals we need to make, get it done. DeAndre let out a low whistle. Shaq, this isn't just a small favor. This is life-changing. Shaq shrugged. That's the point. Mark closed his notebook. We'll handle the paperwork, but does she know any of this yet? Shaq shook his head, a small grin forming. Not yet, but she's about to. With that, he turned and headed back toward the house. Margaret clutched her worn cardigan, the night air sending a slight chill down her spine. She had only stepped outside because Shaq insisted, his voice carrying that deep but gentle authority that made her trust him. Now standing on her front porch beneath the flickering porch light, she looked up at him with curiosity. Shaquille, dear, what's all this about? She asked softly, noticing the two sharply dressed men beside him. Shaq smiled. You'll see. One of the men, Mark Rosen, cleared his throat and stepped forward, holding a thick envelope. Mrs. Margaret, my name is Mark. I'm a lawyer, and I've been working with Shaq on something important. Margaret's frail hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her glasses. A lawyer, she repeated, suddenly nervous. I don't have any legal issues, do I? Shaq chuckled. No, ma'am, nothing like that. This is good news. Good news! Margaret's voice wavered. I don't get much of that these days. Shaq crouched down slightly so he was eye level with her. Well, tonight, that changes. Mark carefully opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of neatly printed documents. This, he said, handing her the first paper, is your deed. As of today, your house is fully paid off. You own it. No more mortgage. No more debt. Margaret blinked. I don't understand. DeAndre, Shaq's financial advisor, stepped in. Mrs. Margaret, Shaq just paid off your house in full. It belongs to you now, free and clear. Margaret gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. No, she whispered. No, that can't be. Her knees buckled slightly and Shaq immediately reached out, steadying her with his large hands. Easy now, he said gently. I told you I wanted to help. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as she clutched the deed against her chest. I worked my whole life to keep this home, she choked out. I thought I was going to lose it. I thought... Shaq patted her shoulder. Not anymore, ma'am. This house is yours forever. Before she could fully process it, Mark handed her another document. And this, he continued, is a guarantee for your medical expenses. You will never have to pay for your prescriptions again. Your medicine is covered for life. Margaret's breath hitched. Shaq grinned. No more skipping doses. No more worrying about the price. From now on, you take your medicine when you need it, not when you can afford it. Margaret's shoulders trembled as she held the papers, her teardrops staining the pages. I don't know what to say. Shaq smiled warmly. You don't have to say anything. Just promise me you'll take care of yourself. Margaret could no longer hold back. The emotions hit her all at once. Relief, gratitude, disbelief. She let out a soft sob, her frail body shaking. Shaq, without hesitation, pulled her into a gentle embrace. The woman who had spent decades struggling, who had gone without so her grandson could eat, was now crying into the chest of an NBA legend. Jason, her grandson, had been standing in the doorway, watching in confusion. Grandma? He asked hesitantly. Margaret turned, her eyes filled with tears but shining with joy. Jason, sweetheart, we're staying. We don't have to leave. The little boy's eyes widened. Really? Shaq winked at him. Really, little man? Jason launched himself into his grandmother's arms, and they held each other tightly, both crying. Shaq exhaled, looking at the scene before him. But he wasn't done yet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something else. Margaret, he said, a playful twinkle in his eye, I still got one more surprise for you. The next morning, the pharmacy doors swung open with a force that made the employees jump. A familiar, towering figure stepped inside. Shaq wasn't done yet. He had spent the night thinking about Margaret, about the countless others like her who were suffering in silence. The way that pharmacist had treated her, it wasn't just disrespectful, it was cruel. And Shaq had never been one to stand by while people were mistreated. The pharmacist, Mr. Reynolds, looked up from behind the counter, his smirk instantly fading as he saw who had just entered. Oh, it's you again, Reynolds muttered, forcing a fake smile. Back for more vitamins? Shaq folded his arms across his chest. his deep voice calm but firm. "Number, I'm back for answers." Reynolds sighed. "Look, if this is about that old lady—" "Margaret," Shaq interrupted. "Her name is Margaret. And yeah, this is about her." Other customers in the store started paying attention. Employees behind the counter exchanged nervous glances. Shaq took a step forward. "Tell me something, Reynolds. You gave a rich guy a discount yesterday, but you wouldn't knock a few dollars off for a woman who could barely afford to eat." "Why is that?" Reynolds scoffed, leaning on the counter. "Business is business. She couldn't pay. That's not my fault." Shaq's jaw tightened. He turned to the customers, his voice carrying through the store. "How many of y'all in here got family members struggling to afford medicine?" A few people raised their hands hesitantly. An elderly man in the back cleared his throat. "My wife skips her heart medication sometimes. It's too expensive." A woman with a young daughter nodded. "My mom had to choose between rent and insulin last month." Shaq turned back to Reynolds. "You hear that?" The pharmacist rolled his eyes. "Listen, I don't set the prices. That's corporate." Shaq smirked. "Funny thing about that," he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I just bought this pharmacy." A stunned silence filled the room. Reynolds' smirk vanished. "What?" Shaq leaned on the counter. "That's right. I made some calls last night. Turns out your boss was real interested in selling when I offered to buy this place in cash. So now," he gestured around the store, "I own this place. And you—" His expression hardened. "You're fired." The employees gasped. A cashier let out a small cheer. A customer laughed under his breath. Reynolds' face turned red. "You can't do that." Shaq shrugged. "Actually, I can. And I just did." Before Reynolds could protest, a woman in her mid-50s stepped forward from the crowd. She wore a clean white coat and had kind eyes that instantly put people at ease. Shaq smiled at her. "Everyone, meet Maria. She's your new ad pharmacist. And she's going to make sure no one in this town ever has to choose between food and medicine again." Maria looked at Reynolds, then at Shaq and nodded. "First change we're making? Senior discounts. Permanent ones." The customers burst into applause. Shaq turned back to Reynolds one last time. "You know, man, being kind doesn't cost a thing. But being cruel," he gestured around the store, "that just cost you your job." The entire community cheered as Reynolds stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Shaq grinned. This was just the beginning. It started with one video, a shaky, grainy clip recorded on someone's phone. At first, it was just a few hundred views, then a few thousand, then within hours, millions. By the next morning, the world was watching. The video captured it all. Margaret struggling at the pharmacy, Shaq stepping in, the greedy pharmacist getting what he deserved, and the entire town cheering as a kind-hearted new pharmacist took his place. The internet couldn't get enough. Comments flooded in. "This is what humanity should be. Shaq out here doing more for people than some politicians. Margaret deserves everything good in this world." People started sharing their own stories. Seniors struggling with medical costs, families choosing between food and prescriptions. The video wasn't just a feel-good moment. It was a wake-up call. By noon, national news stations had picked up the story. Breaking: Shaquille O'Neal changes a grandmother's life with a powerful act of kindness. Talk shows replayed the video, analyzing every second. Morning anchors praised Shaq's generosity while experts discussed the deeper issue. Why was an 82-year-old woman forced to beg for medicine in the first place? One reporter even visited the newly purchased pharmacy, now under new management. Maria, the new pharmacist, smiled as she told them, "No more seniors walking away empty-handed. That's Shaq's first rule." Margaret had no idea any of this was happening. She had never been on social media before, never cared for the internet. But when her grandson Jason came running into the living room, tablet in hand shouting, "Grandma, you're famous!" she knew something big had happened. Her old landline phone rang off the hook. Strangers sent letters to her house. Some even showed up at her doorstep, wanting to meet the woman behind the viral moment. And then came the biggest surprise, an invitation. A well-known talk show wanted Margaret and Shaq to appear together. At first, Margaret hesitated. "Oh, I don't know. I've never been on TV before." Shaq grinned, towering over her as he patted her shoulder. Ain't nothing to it, Margaret. We just talk. She looked at Jason, his eyes shining with excitement. He clutched her hand. Please, Grandma, let's go. Margaret took a deep breath and nodded. All right then, let's go show the world what kindness looks like. As the cameras rolled, the world waited. Margaret adjusted her cardigan, Shaq gave her a reassuring nod, and the host smiled. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the internet's favorite grandma. The bright lights of the talk show studio shined down on Margaret as she sat beside Shaq, clutching her grandson Jason's hand. Just a few days ago, she had been struggling to buy her medicine. Now she was on national television, sharing her story with the world. The host turned toward her with a warm smile. Margaret, your story has touched millions of hearts. How does it feel to go from barely affording medication to sitting here today, debt-free and surrounded by love? Margaret blinked back tears. I still can't believe it, she said softly. All I ever wanted was to survive. I never thought someone like Shaquille O'Neal would walk into my life and change it forever. The audience erupted into applause as Shaq leaned forward, resting his massive hands on his knees. Margaret didn't ask for much, he said. She just wanted her medicine. But no one should have to beg for something so basic. That's why I did what I did. The host nodded. And you did more than just help her, Shaq. You bought out the pharmacy, changed its policies, and now senior citizens in her town never have to worry about affording their prescriptions again? Shaq chuckled. I didn't do it for attention. I just did what's right. As the applause died down, the host turned toward Jason, who sat quietly beside his grandmother, his small hands gripping hers. Now, Jason, she said, smiling at the boy, I heard that you love school and that you dream of becoming a doctor one day. Jason nodded shyly, his eyes lighting up. I want to help people like my grandma. I want to make sure no one has to choose between food and medicine. Shaq grinned. That's a big dream, little man. But guess what? He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. We're making sure that dream comes true. Jason's eyes widened as Shaq handed him the envelope. Inside is a full scholarship, Shaq said. Your college is covering Pharmacist, and she's going to make sure no one in this town ever has to choose between food and medicine again. Maria looked at Reynolds, then at Shaq and nodded. First change we're making? Senior discounts, permanent ones. The customers burst into applause. Shaq turned back to Reynolds one last time. You know, man, being kind doesn't cost a thing, but being cruel, he gestured around the store, that just cost you your job. The entire community cheered as Reynolds stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Shaq grinned. This was just the beginning. It started with one video, a shaky, grainy clip recorded on someone's phone. At first, it was just a few hundred views, then a few thousand, then within hours, millions. By the next morning, the world was watching. The video captured it all. Margaret struggling at the pharmacy, Shaq stepping in, the greedy pharmacist getting what he deserved, and the entire town cheering as a kind-hearted new pharmacist took his place. The internet couldn't get enough. Comments flooded in. This is what humanity should be. Shaq out here doing more for people than some politicians. Margaret deserves everything good in this world. People started sharing their own stories. Seniors struggling with medical costs, families choosing between food and prescriptions. The video wasn't just a feel-good moment. It was a wake-up call. By noon, national news stations had picked up the story. Breaking, Shaquille O'Neal changes a grandmother's life with a powerful act of kindness. Talk shows replayed the video, analyzing every second. Morning anchors praised Shaq's generosity while experts discussed the deeper issue. Why was an 82-year-old woman forced to beg for medicine in the first place? One reporter even visited the newly purchased pharmacy, now under new management. Maria, the new pharmacist, smiled as she told them, no more seniors walking away empty-handed. That's Shaq's first rule. Margaret had no idea any of this was happening. She had never been on social media before, never cared for the internet. But when her grandson Jason came running into the living room, tablet in hand shouting, Grandma, you're famous! She knew something big had happened. Her old landline phone rang off the hook. Strangers sent letters to her house. Some even showed up at her doorstep, wanting to meet the woman behind the viral moment. And then came the biggest surprise, an invitation. A well-known talk show wanted Margaret and Shaq to appear together. At first, Margaret hesitated. "Oh, I don't know. I've never been on TV before." Shaq grinned, towering over her as he patted her shoulder. "Ain't nothing to it, Margaret. We just talk." She looked at Jason, his eyes shining with excitement. He clutched her hand. "Please, Grandma, let's go." Margaret took a deep breath and nodded. "All right then, let's go show the world what kindness looks like." As the cameras rolled, the world waited. Margaret adjusted her cardigan, Shaq gave her a reassuring nod, and the host smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the internet's favorite grandma." The bright lights of the talk show studio shined down on Margaret as she sat beside Shaq, clutching her grandson Jason's hand. Just a few days ago, she had been struggling to buy her medicine. Now she was on national television, sharing her story with the world. The host turned toward her with a warm smile. "Margaret, your story has touched millions of hearts. How does it feel to go from barely affording medication to sitting here today, debt-free and surrounded by love?" Margaret blinked back tears. "I still can't believe it," she said softly. "All I ever wanted was to survive. I never thought someone like Shaquille O'Neal would walk into my life and change it forever." The audience erupted into applause as Shaq leaned forward, resting his massive hands on his knees. "Margaret didn't ask for much," he said. "She just wanted her medicine. But no one should have to beg for something so basic. That's why I did what I did." The host nodded. "And you did more than just help her, Shaq. You bought out the pharmacy, changed its policies, and now senior citizens in her town never have to worry about affording their prescriptions again." Shaq chuckled. "I didn't do it for attention. I just did what's right." As the applause died down, the host turned toward Jason, who sat quietly beside his grandmother, his small hands gripping hers. "Now, Jason," she said, smiling at the boy, "I heard that you love school and that you dream of becoming a doctor one day." Jason nodded shyly, his eyes lighting up. "I want to help people like my grandma. I want to make sure no one has to choose between food and medicine." Shaq grinned. "That's a big dream, little man. But guess what?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "We're making sure that dream comes true." Jason's eyes widened as Shaq handed him the envelope. "Inside is a full scholarship," Shaq said. "Your college is covering